We're an artificial construct, a temporary resident. Everybody knows it. Doesn't make any difference what you say. Everyone knows it. Years ago, 1968, I was in Hungary, in Budapest. I was learning to speak German. This is just before I went to Germany as exchange student. I was 15 years old. And I spoke enough German to talk to a young man who was standing out in front of the American embassy looking at photographs of supposed American atrocities in Vietnam and the terrible things we were doing to the Vietnamese people. I said to the Hungarian in German, and in those days, everybody in Eastern Europe spoke German as a second language. Now it's English. I said, do you believe that? And he looked at me, smugly, and he said, who knows? He was no fool. He knew the communists lied about everything all the time, everywhere. So I said, well, what happens to Hungary? Will you survive? And he said something to me that I will never forget. He said, the Turks were here for 300 years, and we are still here. He's right. Don't lose sight of those points. We've lost sight of it. We think that we're bringing to these people something that is so wonderful they can't possibly resist it. And we're ignoring the cultural, linguistic, religious, racial differences that make that ridiculous. So, people on the Hill have figured it out. Nobody wants to stand up and say, let's go and save all the money, but they're headed that way. So there is no future for that anymore. And the battle cry now really is, no more Iraqs, no more Afghanistans, and I'm old enough to remember 1975, no more Vietnams. Of course, we know this only lasts about 20, 25 years, and the usual suspects like O'Hanlon come back and encourage us to do these things. So, emphasis for us in the Army, what are we going to do? Well, it's going to be expeditionary. It's not going to be on a huge scale. In other words, we're not looking at hundreds of thousands of troops in all probability. If we do commit forces, I would say it's not impossible to see 40 or 50,000, but we will only commit them when we have real allies. I mean, real allies. People that are going to fight shoulder to shoulder with us for a very specific purpose in a conflict or crisis. In other cases, we will now cross national boundaries and kill people who are the enemies of the United States. That is a positive development since 9/11, in my judgment. Punitive operations are real. Sometimes they will involve ground forces. Most of the time they won't. But sometimes they will, and we have to be ready to execute that. But we're going to be involved increasingly in limited liability partnerships. What do I mean by that? Look, NATO is imploding. Anybody here thinks NATO is real? Other than a debating society, an opportunity for us to channel our preferences to the Europeans? Most Europeans are walking away from that sort of thing. Does anybody really think the European Union is going to survive? I don't even want to touch the euro. My point is, all of the institutions that we're accustomed to have reached block obsolescence. They're going to be swept away. We're going to cooperate with the people who share an interest with us. Where could that happen? The Vietnamese, right now, privately would love to see the United States Navy return to Cam Ranh Bay. The president of the Philippines just spoke recently, publicly, and wrote an article talking about the Chinese Navy shelling Philippine gunboats and essentially harming Philippine fishermen, driving their fishing fleets off. The Vietnamese and the Chinese have had their differences before, but the Chinese, despite all of their alleged wisdom from our friend Sun Tzu, seem to have buried their copy of Sun Tzu, and they have managed within the last year to absolutely offend, threaten, upset, and inspire nothing but fear and loathing from Korea to Japan to the Philippines to Vietnam, and even frighten and upset the people that are in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. Now, those people that I've just described are going to be limited liability partners. They are not going to march with us into Venezuela. It's not going to happen. Just as most of them want nothing to do with Afghanistan or Iraq. But to the extent that our interests coincide and overlap, they will work with us. They will work with us. And that also sets up another dynamic that we lose sight of. We are so accustomed to seeing ourselves at the center of the universe that we forget there are other players, that we don't necessarily have to drain our treasury to do everything, that there are others out there who will do more. And by the way, once you pull forces out, particularly on the ground in Korea and Japan, I rather anticipate a profound increase in Japanese and Korean investment in military power. Because thus far, remember, for the last 50 years, we've essentially absolved everybody from the responsibility to invest heavily in defense. We've done it. We can't afford it. It can't go on. That doesn't mean we're finished. It doesn't mean Asia is going to fall into the hands of the Chinese. I just explained to you why it won't. By the way, that hatred and fear of China extends all the way around the periphery. The Mongols in Outer Mongolia want to conduct ethnic cleansing to push every Chinese out, because the Chinese represent a threat to these people on different levels from us. We don't really see them as a threat, and I'm not sure that we need to in most cases, other than this dramatic economic expansion. But then again, China's been through several series of economic expansions and subsequent implosions, so I'm not sure it's a permanent state. But if you live next to them, you're worried about their racial, genetic component, their ability to absorb you, their cultural power, their economic power, last of all, their military power. Because if you get the Koreans and the Japanese, the Mongols and the Vietnamese quietly in a room together, they will tell you Chinese aren't much good at military stuff. We are. And they are. They are warlike. It's a different group of people. But they fear them, and they have every reason to fear them, and that fear is not going away. And that can work very much to our advantage, because we won't have to spend as much money as we historically have. Now, ISR and strike. In 1991, we saw, I think in one case during Desert Storm, 163 cruise missiles launched, of which only about 67 actually found their way to the target. Of course, if you watch CNN, you would never have known that, because we only saw the ones that actually hit something. That's changed. They hit the targets. This precision paradigm, which was in an infantile state in 1991, has actually achieved a much higher level of lethality and accuracy. It is also no longer an American monopoly. The Chinese are investing very heavily in it. The Indians are investing in it. Other countries around the world are investing in that capability. And that's going to change the dynamic on the ground, because we will not have the option of essentially operating without the threat of being struck from above. Whether that strike comes long range, short range, from the air, from the sea, from the land, makes no difference. High lethality, low density is where we've got to go as a force. We are going to get smaller. The Marine Corps is going to get smaller. On the ground, we must present more lethality, not less. And we cannot move hundreds of thousands of troops, which means that whatever you commit has to be able to mobilize military power, combat power, fighting power on a scale that is disproportionate. This leads you to conditions that I call mobile dispersed warfare. I've been very unhappy with all of the terminology that you get from time to time in Washington. I'm sure you've heard all about hybrid warfare. Frank Hoffman's a friend of mine. He came up with this, and he's ridden that ticket to greatness. All warfare is hybrid. It's always been hybrid. There's no such thing as a pure form of warfare. That's just silly nonsense. But people latch onto these things. People with a cocktail level of familiarity with real warfare inside the Beltway, and then senior officers who think this is a ticket that somehow or another will justify expenditures and expansion and so forth. I would forget all of that and just think in these broad terms. Battlefields have been emptying for centuries. This is nothing new. It's only going to get worse. The only way to survive in that situation is to be very mobile. If you entrench yourself, if you dig yourself in, if you operate from fixed bases in the future, you are going to be a victim of that strike ISR complex which is growing overseas. Others will hit you, and you will be out of business. So the whole idea of operating from these large fixed bases needs to go away. That's not easy. That's going to require a lot of people to do a lot of thinking, particularly about logistics and in terms of modernization. And then finally, this lethality piece. We have to rethink this inordinate focus on the man with the rifle. We need men with rifles. But the man with the rifle is not the centerpiece. And if we try to make him the centerpiece, he's going to die in great numbers, much as he did in World War I, in World War II, and in Korea. Remember that in less than 6 months of fighting in World War I in 1918, we sustained 310,000 casualties. Of that number, 110,000 men died. We haven't seen anything like that over the last 20 years anywhere. But that's the kind of lethality that is waiting for us in the future. So we're going to have to rethink how we plan to do business with it. And it's also going to have a big impact politically, because politicians are going to be very reluctant to commit large numbers of ground forces that they think are going to be at high risk of destruction. Again, the biggest military advantage lies with integration, these integrated command structures. Look, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, a battle that should never have happened for strategic reasons if you were thinking straight in the German side, but did nonetheless, involved 950,000 German and Allied troops against perhaps 1.5 million Soviet troops. The Soviet troops entrenched themselves. They immobilized themselves. They had some armored reserves, but essentially built this enormously and very effective static defense. The Germans were dumb enough to attack it. Today, that static defense would be annihilated from the air by the United States Air Force in hours. And that battle, by the way, was fought over an area the size of England. Dwarfs anything that happened anywhere else in modern military history. That kind of battle cannot happen again, because if it were to happen, all of those defending Soviet forces would be destroyed. That's where we're heading. So think again about this issue of mobility. It cannot be overstated in its importance. Next slide. So what do we need? Well, I've been writing books about this sort of thing, and I'm a colonel. And I was asked to leave and thanked for my interest in national defense. But my views have not changed. You need high-performance combat forces to fight integrated all-arms operations. We in the United States Army like to talk about combined arms. That's all right. It's a 1942 concept. We have to think in terms of all arms. We need to think of this constellation of capabilities, the thousands of satellites, the thousands of strike systems at sea, in the air, the enormous capability that resides in the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, as well as in our own service. How can these be integrated for maximum effect? Because if we do commit overseas in the future, as I said before, it will not be on the massive scale that we've seen over the last few years, and certainly not on the scale of Desert Storm. So what do you need? These are the features. And this is not new. This was essentially what I argued in 1997 and 2003. It's beginning to get some traction. It really is. We have to have standards to which people are held. There has to be real accountability. Look, in the United States Navy over the last 12 months, 11 officers, including 2 promotable captains, the rest were flag officers, were relieved. They were relieved for various failures, for the most part, involving shipbuilding. But some were also relieved for failing technically in other areas overseas. Why? Because in the Navy, you have to keep the water out and the people in. There is very little margin for error. We need that kind of thinking in the U.S. Army, because we don't hold people accountable. And I'll come back to that. And they must be. And accountability begins not at the bottom, begins at the top and works its way down. Unconstrained thinking and action. Everybody's going to burst out in hysterics. Where do we have that? We have that all over the Army, don't we? Everyone can express an opinion, right? As long as it agrees with the man in the room who wears the most stars. Because the man in the room with the most stars is always right. That's Army culture. Won't work. Can't get there from here. It's got to go away. It's part of the reason we lost $1 trillion in Iraq, along with thousands of good men and women. Next slide. Now, some of you will think back to the 1970s, late 1980s, or early 1980s, and you'll remember the name Ogarkov, Marshal Ogarkov. He was the chief of the Soviet General Staff, which at the time, ladies and gentlemen, was a pretty damn good replica of the old German General Staff in terms of quality of thinking and personnel.